All right, it's 5:30. We'll call to order this afternoon's meeting of the ISD 191 School Board Policy Review Committee. Um, Board members in attendance are Tony Connor and myself. We're waiting for Sue Saeed to join us. I'm sure she will be along shortly. And as staff members, we have Amina Oftedal, Brian Gersich, Dr. Battle, as well as Jamie Kenny and Aaron waiting in the wings. With that, just jump right into the policies themselves, starting with policy 501, school weapons policy. Brian, over to you.
Yep. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity here. So I have 3 policies that I'll cover, and I'll just kind of take them as they come up on the agenda. And I would say I'll make a couple of comments. Right now, they're coming forward for review without any recommended changes. But I still would, encourage everyone to kind of dig into them a little bit. These are 3 pretty critical policies when it comes to student behaviors and management. And one of the things that the board, unfortunately, at times might be faced with is the expulsion of a student. And a lot of times between these 3, you'll see that at least a couple of them are where a lot of those tend to come from. So just having a general understanding, and then just one policy that I'll mention later that might have some confusion as we look at the SRO agreement that's coming up as well. This first one, school weapons policy, again, no recommended changes. A lot of the language here is either verbatim or closely parallels the laws that are cross-referenced at the bottom about weapons possessions in school. Certainly what it does is it forbids students from having weapons or replica weapons on school property. So that's pretty much the extent of my thoughts on 501, or starting off with the weapons policy.
All right, thank you, Brian. Tony, do you have any comments or questions about this policy?
Excuse me, I do not. I think it's pretty clear cut. And also when it mentioned things that could be used as a weapon, I think that's important, and that was in there. So I think it was very, very accurate, very thorough.
Awesome. Thank you. So I had a couple of questions. So Brian, you said that the definition of the weapons within the policy pretty much fall in alignment with state statute.
Yeah, no, thanks for that clarification. I would say what a lot of the pieces of the policy follow verbatim through the state statute. I think there's various definitions, for example, of a firearm. That's verbatim all the way through because the definition of firearm hits the state statute straight from there. I'm not sure if all of the things under definition of weapon are, because some of those might have been expanded from what's actually in the law. But I would have to actually go back and verify if that definition piece. But a lot of these are verbatim from the ones that I've checked before.
Okay. I guess my only question is whether we would want to include taser or similar electronic immobilizer. That I don't know how prevalent it is, but I know it certainly is something that could be in the hands of people in our schools.
Yep. I think that is what is intended by, there's a piece in there that says stun gun, but maybe I should look at that and see if maybe that's an outdated way to describe what a taser is, because I do think it probably is a similar kind of thing, but that might be a cross-reference just to see if there's an update between taser and stun gun. I know in here too is like the use of a laser pointer, for example, which can burn the retina or other kinds of things. Use of that is cited in here, but I'll take a look at statute and find out if there's anything specific to this or if taser might be an update. Does that make sense?
That does. And Brian, I think we can trust you to make whatever adjustment is needed with that terminology based on what you find out.
Yep, perfect.
Then, hold on. So the question is regarding section 4B7, specifically possession of dangerous weapons. And I guess, let's see. The context is persons who keep or store on a motor vehicle pistols in accordance with the state statute or other firearms. Possession of dangerous weapons, BB guns, or replica firearms with written permission of the principal or other person having general control and supervision of the school or the director of a child care center. When would this come into play?
I guess it's interesting because I have a little question mark thing by that as well as when I originally looked at it, but I think there is a situation when this may have been in school as part of curriculum kinds of materials. So I actually had an experience in my career where someone actually had I don't know if it was like a musket, some kind of a World War II functioning item. They wanted to bring it in as a part of a Civil War unit. In that situation, I was a principal at the time, arranged for that to happen. But what I had was a school resource officer meet the family outside off of, as they came onto the property, took possession of the item, verified there wasn't anything loaded within it, brought it to the classroom. It was the officer going through there. So that's where there may be a situation or a replica or something where it might actually be used. I know that it's kind of mentioned earlier. There's a part that talks about not wanting to inhibit curriculum. Actually, it's just down below. But I look at that as, more, knives in a culinary arts class comparatively to something like this that might actually happen as a part of a curriculum. I'd say it's probably pretty rare that we're going to want to have something like that. But again, that antique relic that still technically functioned as a firearm was an example from just my history where we did make exceptions to allow that to come in.
Would, so looking ahead, should we implement a law enforcement pathway? This phrase might come into play if a police officer comes in as part of the curriculum. I'm not familiar enough to know.
Yeah, from a, I don't know if that necessarily fits within the policy, but if we would develop some kind of a procedure where if that actually happened, this is what we would do. Part of it just when I think about when I made that decision, and I wonder if I would make that same decision today, I would probably be using technology differently and saying, how can we do this experience? So part of it might be a matter of saying, yes, develop procedures if we're going to, or we might just say in the current era, it might not be worth the risk reward. Again, something to think about. But
yeah, and I guess that you kind of touched on my next question, which is, are we comfortable with leaving this simply as a decision that the building administrator would make? And this is completely open-ended. I don't know the answer to it. Is this something that we would want to, have rest on the shoulders of the principal? Would there be someone else that might want to be aware that this is happening? I don't know. Tony, do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess the resource officer would be a good person to be involved in that.
But in terms of district staff, I think there's I'm kind of making a distinction between the SRO and the building principal as district staff. Is there someone at the within the district who's an employee who might need to? And I don't know. I just want to ask the question.
Yeah, I can't think of anybody else besides the principal and the SRO.
Okay.
So can I just ask a clarifying question? In that situation, are you, for example, suggesting perhaps that if somebody is doing that, they need to notify, superintendent or designee that it's going to be there or something?
Some kind of notification. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be part of the, I don't want to take away the authority of the building principal, but awareness might be a good thing.
Yeah, I can certainly take a look at where that fits, kind of review the policy again as to what that looks like and see if there's some kind of, at least, as you said, a communication process to ensure that we would know that that exists.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure this happens pretty rarely, right? Like, say, for instance, if you were going to use this as a prop for a play or something like that, you would you would be notified in advance of this
Yeah.
type of prop from,
Yeah, we don't allow that corrected prop or replica.
Well, I'd have to look into that. I would not be as definitive when you use the term like replica, because in there it says replica firearm. And if we have some of our productions, is it possible somebody would use a replica? It's possible. Like until I asked the question, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying for sure. It never happened.
I think I remember seeing a replica in, I want to say it was Les Mis a couple of years ago at the high school. So good question, Tony. And
yeah, I've seen plays where they've done that, but of course, it wasn't this current climate like you mentioned to either. So
yeah.
And again, just awareness, I think probably makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Sue, welcome. We're still on our first policy, school weapons. I'm not sure if you have any questions about it.
Yeah, yep. I'm just going to pull up my other screen here. Give me 1 minute, please.
Sure. And just to review, Sue, Brian is going to look into terminology stun gun versus taser or similar electronic immobilizer, and based on what the current language is, either or edit. And then we've kind of been talking about general possession of weapons and replicas in the schools.
Okay.
Go ahead.
was there any further discussion, or did you ask Sue a question, or?
I'm just waiting to see if Sue had any questions about the first policy.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I was just pulling it up, but no, I don't.
You don't. Okay.
No.
Okay, awesome. We will move on to the next policy. Go ahead, Brian.
All right. 502, search of student lockers, desks, possessions. Again, on this policy, I don't have any recommended changes, just a couple things I wanted to point out. And one is just so that when it comes forward with the SRO agreement and you look at them and say, hey, is there a difference between these? Yes, there's a difference between the language that's used in a policy for schools when it comes to search and seizure and what police officers are expected to do. In schools, we require a lower threshold that gives us permission to search a student in their possessions. We require reasonable suspicion. Police have what everyone commonly knows as probable cause, which is a different threshold that we have in schools because, again, there is kind of what's called in loco parentis or in place of the parent, giving schools more freedom to be able to do that. You can't just do it randomly, except lockers and desks. Lockers and desks are school district property. We can open those and look in them anytime we desire because they are our property and we protect that right. We usually don't go through randomly and without suspicion doing it, but we can pop open a locker, but we couldn't search, for example, a jacket or a book bag in there without that reasonable suspicion. Somebody comes to the office and says, I saw, Abigail Alt smoking marijuana in the bathroom. That's enough that we'd be able to search Abigail, her pockets, her bags, and things like that. So again, lower threshold than the police officer who would actually have to have some kind of. And again, I don't mean to make it longer than it has to be, but just want to point out that potential confusion. If you've been reading the SRO agreement, and now you read this policy, yep, they're different. They are different, and police have a different.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Sue, Tony, questions, comments for Brian?
Yeah, I do need some clarification. Does it take more than one? I thought I read that it takes, you have to have two school employees when you're doing a search. Is that correct?
Not a requirement, but it's a best practice. And I would say whenever you have witnesses, the more intrusive the search, the more you should have somebody else there. And again, when I say level of intrusion, if someone's going to be reaching into someone else's pockets, you should probably have somebody else there. Across, gender, a male staff member should not be reaching their hands in the pockets of a female student. Again, those are some of the things you'd want to generally have as well. But it is not a requirement, and it's not always practical. But it is a best practice if you have the ability to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's on personal, but I meant just even if you're, for the example that you used, if another student reported a behavior of another student and you're just taking their word of mouth, and you went to search their locker, would the principal just decide that, or would you take a principal and a social worker, a principal and a teacher?
A lot of times the principal could just decide to do that. And again,
Okay.
if there's a sense of urgency to things, as a principal, I would just go and open the locker and see what I would see there. And if I found something, that might be the next step. Anytime. My exception, and I have to find out what our team does. If I was going to the potential report of a weapon in a locker, called my SRO and just asked them to be nearby. It was still my search because I have reasonable suspicion. I still did that. But if I found something, I want that person right there to take possession of.
Whenever a possible student's being searched, I'm not talking about like locker and stuff, but their personal possessions. Are we doing that in front of our classroom friends, or are we doing that alone, secluded in the office somewhere that that student doesn't feel ashamed, embarrassed, or maybe bullied by other students the next time?
Good question. No, that would be done in private.
Okay.
And that's to, the comment before about should you have another person present, that would be another reason why you might have another person present, is that it is usually in a situation where you get into a principal's office, an empty conference room, other kinds of things for exactly that reason, to protect the privacy, as well as just to kind of secure the environment. A lot of times before you go in and check a student, a lot of times you're going to ask some questions first. You're going to ask them a few things before you search them. You don't usually just go right to that. And those interviews would also be happening in a more private and secluded location.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
Abigail or Sue, do you think that almost should be maybe included in the policy, that there should be 2 school staff with any search and seizure, maybe? Just to protect the staff?
I would just say, if you wanted to put something like that in there, certainly I'm not going to fight it. That's the authority of the board, but I would just say it's not always practical to do that. And you're also protecting the privacy and the integrity of the individual. And I just think the more you expand that beyond sometimes that gets risked. It is a best practice when it's practical to do it. But I would just be cautious how much you put that in there as a policy requirement, because it does, create some of those complexities at times and people challenging it.
Okay.
I could see timing being of the essence depending on what you're talking about, and understanding that our staff will protect themselves from liability wherever they can, they certainly will. But if there's something that needs to happen in the moment, then tying their hands might not be in the best interest of everyone. I had questions, section 3C. Reasonable suspicion, of course, you talked about that. That's a search will uncover a violation. Wait a minute, maybe I'm looking at the wrong one. Hold on. There's language referring to the student's age and past history, record of conduct, other reliable sources of information. And I guess my question, it's in the definition, that's what it is. And maybe there's nothing that can be done. I certainly don't want to undermine safety and security in our schools. But I did think about, implicit bias in terms of a student's past history. How does that play itself out in policy? And is the fact that someone doesn't have a past history mean that somehow they might be treated differently than someone who does have a history?
Yep. It's a really good question that I would have to think about through that lens. I think the first few times that I've read through this, I continue to come back to behavior that is out of the norm for what you know for that student to engage in behavior. So, and again, something as simple as I know this kid is usually in second hour right now at this particular time of day, and I see them in a completely separate location of the building kind of a thing. Like, I didn't think of it in the terms of conduct truly as you're describing it. I just thought of it in terms of their known patterns of behavior. So I'd have to think back, because I understand your question about, I don't want that to be, this kid's always a troublemaker,
Right.
and therefore that's suspicious. And so I'm just going to search them. And that's not, I don't believe that's what's intended, but as I read it with that lens, I understand your point. I just don't know that right now I would have a recommendation, but I would want to think about that a little bit.
Yeah, that would be fine, because I don't, it's just something that came to mind, and while we're have us discuss it and think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you, Abigail. I think that's a great point, and something to definitely think about. As implicit bias is there, and we don't want to seclude a student from, putting them in a box when that's not our intention at all here.
On the other hand, I mean, playing it out, regardless of past history, well, glass half full, trying to be glass half full. If a student has nothing on their person or hasn't, then that certainly would be discovered. But again, if past history is kind of identifying who might be identified, then my concern would be lack of history as far as conduct. So yeah, we'll think about that.
Okay.
And maybe Brian, maybe we just put a pin on that and have it come back, give you a chance to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then section 4F. School official conducting any other search may determine when it is appropriate to have a second official present as an observer.
Which one? Which section are you in?
Actually, you already covered this. It's 4F, Brian. We already covered it.
Okay.
So is that the one where, Brian, you said you were given an example of that you are doing the search, but you are including an officer to kind of watch? Is that what that one is kind of alluding to?
I think that would be one example, but the other was what we were talking about earlier about having best practice be, if you're going to search somebody, having somebody else with you as a part
Oh,
of
okay, I see. All right.
Yep.
Okay.
And again, if I, as a male principal, assistant principal, was going to search a female, I would probably bring a female with to do, again, we're not doing strip searches. We're not doing things overly intrusive, but again, we are in a private space with another student. That's where some of that, I think, comes in.
And again, I just think it ties back into what you guys were saying about singling out. So a student wouldn't feel singled out if there were two people there as opposed to just one. Then they wouldn't come back with, oh, you're just picking on me. And you have another adult there kind of as a witness to how this went down. I mean, I can think of scenarios when I was in the school system where this has happened. And I just feel like, from my experience, it's a good practice to really have two people there. I'm not talking about for, personal search and seizure. I'm talking about lockers and backpacks and, well, not necessarily lockers, but personal things like backpacks or jackets or coats, that type of thing. Not lockers, because lockers are school property, like you said. But it's just a thought. I mean, I'm just saying.
All right. As far as directives and guidelines, how do we know that students and staff, are aware of directives and guidelines that relate to this policy?
You know, I don't know. I mean, as far as you're talking about the directions and guidelines, school administration may establish reasonable directives and guidelines which address specific needs of the school district, such as use of tape in lockers, standards of cleanliness and care, posting pinups and posters which may constitute sexual harassment, etc.
I don't know how dated that language is. It was kind of curious to me, and if there are directives and guidelines, I hope that there are, because it certainly makes things it makes, responses more predictable.
So Brian, you can check. In my experience, there are locker managers, and that's part of their duty to communicate to students. So we can check on that with our principals, but usually the locker manager who's given that assignment, and that was the old days. We have different lockers now.
Right. I mean, what is the use of tape in lockers?
Yeah.
I don't remember that in 2005.
It's a weird one for. Whoops, sorry. It's a weird one for me because I feel like this policy is about search and seizure.
Then why are we talking about how to decorate a locker?
This feels more like how you treat our property, which is just a weird, ill-placed statement. That's why when I read it, I'm like, what is this even doing here? So I didn't anticipate the question. I don't remember, like I read through that, probably breezed right past it because it's like, that just almost is not a fit.
Yeah, because let's review that because I remember it was very clear the locker managers would put that out. It's our property.
Mm-hmm.
Not to have anything that could be disparaging to other people. You can't put on the outside of your locker, tape up, I hate so and so. No.
So that'll come back to.
And from my experience, the homeroom teachers, they have a time where they clean out lockers, like usually once a quarter or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything about the policy that is necessarily problematic. And I'm wondering if I talk to our principals, if there's something within handbook language or otherwise that talks about care for lockers and things. Again, for me, it's just like, it's a weird inclusion in this particular piece of the policy. I'm trying to think about the connection. What's the practical connection to include here?
I mean, I'm thinking it's kind of going towards, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, right? What is causing harm to someone else, that sexual harassment piece, or anything that might be shown racism or whatever. I get that piece, but it's like the wording of it is just really outdated to me.
And one perspective to think about is that if it is our property and we are searching people's lockers, that folks who have not adhered to the kind of the guidelines of what goes in the locker, that is, if we're suspicious that somebody is, has, derogatory stuff taped to their locker, that would be a reasonable violation.
Right. And at the onset, it says lockers and last desks are district property. So maybe that's just the one place where they felt like there needed to be a flex of, and we get to control how you use it, how you treat it, how you hang things up in it, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if it's inappropriate, usually a teacher will just ask them that that's inappropriate. You have to take that down, and they do. I mean,
how is this cleared? In regarding a student posting something or putting something on their locker that is showcasing pride or that's showcasing BLM, whatever the case might be, that they're supporting their identity. I mean, how are we making that clear in this way too, right? Like,
Well, we do.
Policy is that they can't tape anything in their locker.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have to find other ways of expressing their pride.
Okay.
I mean,
but there's another policy too that specifically, and I don't know the number, that specifically states that when you're wearing things of self-pride, like, Black Lives Matter or a swastika or different things, if whatever you're supporting is, what's the term they use? Well, anyway, if it's
disruptive.
Yes, yeah, to
Disruptive.
somebody else, then it's not considered, you
Educational.
can't have it on
Yeah.
your locker or anything like that. Because, like for the example, Black Lives Matter isn't really a disruptive thing. It's supposed to be kind of a positive thing, even though people can take it different ways. But like, say, a Confederate flag, for example, that could be a real disruptive thing for somebody else. I mean, that kind of is.
Well, and I think the distinction with this policy is school property versus personal property. Oh, Tony,
Yeah.
Hey, Tony, can you say that again? We didn't hear you.
Huh?
No, I
That
think we're getting emergency alerts, Abigail, you're hearing in the background.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, my screen was freezing up sometime when you guys were talking. That's why I had to try to put my screen closer to the Wi-Fi so that it, I don't know why I was doing that.
Well, good discussion.
Yeah, but it's interesting, this policy was adopted in 95 and then it was last reviewed in 2017 and that section is still in there, so very good point.
Yeah.
And the last question I had about this policy, it's really just a terminology question. In section 7, the last two words that they'll be referred to legal officials. I think it's law enforcement. Or do we mean attorneys?
No, I think you're probably right. Let me review that again, but I think you're probably right. I just want to make
Abigail,
sure.
I'm sorry, which one were you saying?
Sorry, I'm getting my alert now.
In section 7 of that same policy, Sue, you can't hear. Can you hear me now?
Who can hear you?
Okay.
I hear you.
So
I can hear you now.
Section 7 of that same policy,
Oh.
legal officials, it probably should be law enforcement.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I'll double check if that's pulled from anywhere in particular before making that adjustment on the next go, but I think that makes sense. I could understand and agree that legal officials, you might say, well, that means the attorneys, right? Not the police.
All right. So moving on to the next policy, 513, student promotion, retention, and program design.
Yes, so as a policy, this is just part of the review cycle for this. There aren't any significant recommended changes. There have been no changes in statute for this policy, and policy-wise, it functions very well for our current, even for our current situation. It is the procedures that we continue to update and align and make sure that they follow what's asked for in the policy.
Awesome. Thank you, Amina. Two questions or comments? I just had one, and I'm comparing this to policy 102, equal educational opportunity. I think our terminology needs to be updated. Looking at section 2B, low income should be status with regard to public assistance. Minority, we probably should be using race. English language learner probably becomes national origin. And I'm wondering, do we want to add religion?
We certainly can update that language. It is the language exactly word for word from the statute.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
I'm not saying I'm not saying that it needs to remain that way, but it is the exact language word for word from the statute.
Okay.
And you'll notice that it's part of the phrase, including but not limited to. So I feel like we can use updated language there if we would so desire, and I'd be happy to craft, because language matters.
It does. I think at the very least, I would like minority changed to race.
Race, ethnicity.
Race, ethnicity, sure. Yep. And the it's just so odd that that's statutory language, and yet we have this other language in the equal educational opportunity policy.
Right.
I don't know. Board members, what do you guys think?
I agree.
I think the language definitely needs to be on board with the times we're in right now. It really gets, you know, we need to continue with that idea of, you know, we're here for everyone, and that minority word is not something that's excluding a lot, you know.
It's not even accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true too.
Well, I think we also need to, while the word itself is not very accurate, we also need to be aware that in this case, in this sentence, they're talking about assessments and procedures of in CPSS language, of the dominant culture over the non-dominant culture. And that's why the word minority is there, because both in assessments and procedures, there can be biases, barriers that are built into those because they're based on dominant culture versus non-dominant culture.
I can buy that.
And so it's really important just to kind of keep that in mind, that it goes beyond just race and ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly can mirror that language and send that back.
Given that explanation and the filter that we need to have top of mind when it comes to assessments, the language makes more sense to me. But you know, Tony, Sue, completely open for discussion as fellow committee members.
I mean, I see the way you explain it in that perspective, and I understand those lenses. But you know, if family members and students are reading that, the word minority just carries a different tone. I know for me it does, right? So I just want to make sure that I'm able also to see it through their lenses.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that was the enlightened view when they wrote this.
Exactly. Yeah. But a lot of the things that are written that we look back now shouldn't have been written that way. But I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
So maybe we just make a change to race, ethnicity.
Yeah. Yes.
From minority, and then we'll kind of creep forward that way. Does that work with you both?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. And that was okay. That was my only question on that policy. Next, we have policy 526, hazing prohibition.
Yep, so just up for review, another one with no recommended changes. This is one that I had a chance to send by our athletic and activities directors as well. That's typically where you see instances of hazing that end up being reported, or if you see newsworthy things, it's a lot of where they are. So it's just good to get this in front of them too, so they're reminding themselves of checking their practices of how they communicate with coaches about this. But it's a requirement. The districts have this policy for obvious reasons. These, I mean, just again, the stories we hear in the news about the pressure that kids are put under to potentially join clubs, activities, sports, etc. So yeah, that's just kind of the brief overview.
Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
Thank you.
Committee members?
I don't have any questions on that.
When I read it, it seemed clear cut to me, so.
Mhm.
The only question that I had was on 7B, dissemination of policy. So the policy is reviewed only with employees and students. But we also have volunteers and contractors covered in this policy too. How does everyone receive this information? What are the communications around that?
Yeah, so when you're saying about volunteers and others?
Yeah.
Yep, I'd have to look into that. I'm not sure like how a volunteer gets this policy. So you're thinking like, for example, volunteer coaches.
Volunteer coaches or, you know, I hate to pick on the bus drivers, but they're a contractor, right? That could have,
Yep.
you know, some kind of contact.
Transporting to events and games and things like that. So
Contractors and volunteers, just, I understand that employees and students are receiving this information.
Yep. Yeah, I'll certainly take a look into a little bit about how we do that, both with contractors, volunteers, or otherwise about how it's disseminated in general. I don't know, like, do we have a volunteer contractor handbook or otherwise where this stuff is covered in there? So I'll have to do a little research and get back to you.
Okay, awesome. All right, so next. Like policy 546 is our last one. Is that right? Yep.
Say
Policy
that was our-
546, early admission.
You said that was our last one?
Mhm.
I don't think we went over 513, did we?
Oh, geez. No, we didn't. Thank you, Tony. 513, my apologies.
That's okay.
Sorry, just to be clear, we did early admission to K out of sequence. Is that what we're talking about here, or?
No, I think we did.
We did promotion and retention. We haven't talked about early entrance to kindergarten.
Yeah.
No, we haven't. Okay, we haven't did that one. Yeah, okay.
546.
Wait, we didn't discuss promotion and retention.
Yes, that was the policy we were just looking at.
That was the one with the discussion about language of changing the word minority. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that was that one? Oh,
Mhm.
okay. Okay. I didn't get that. Maybe that was when you guys were, when it was freezing up and I didn't get the policy.
That could be.
Okay.
So, Amina.
Sure. Early entrance to kindergarten, again, there's no changes in the legislation or reasons that this was brought forward for a significant change. Again, the policy is pretty straightforward. It is the procedures that we continue to refine and, try to create that a very clear procedure. There is an attached form that is included, and that follows the kind of our procedural process that's outlined. I don't recommend any changes.
Okay. Tony or Sue, questions or comments?
I think that section is very self-explanatory. I don't really have any comments or questions about it.
Nor do I.
Great.
I don't either. So now we need to go back. Okay, so we have, in terms of moving forward for board consideration at a regular board meeting, school weapons. Brian, were we holding on that because there were a couple of items?
Yeah, I might just summarize it and cut some time for you. I think all of them have some things I'd like to look at before you make a decision as to where it goes. So
Okay.
if you're okay with it, bringing these back potentially to the next meeting with either here's what I recommend for changes or why I recommend not changing.
That'd be great.
Mhm.
And maybe just for our own clarity, I don't know, Tony, Sue, let me know if this would work for you. If we have the policies that were discussed today kind of grouped together as, these were, the policies that we considered at our previous meeting, and then any other policies that haven't yet been discussed would come as the right group.
Yes,
That works. Brian, does that work for you?
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. Anything else, anybody? No?
I have
All
a
right.
clarifying question. So are we going to hold on 546? That one didn't have changes, but Brian's going to bring that one back too?
Yes.
No, I'm sorry. My mistake. I'm talking about the 3 policies that I covered. So that would be weapons and hazing and search of lockers. I will let Amina determine for those 2 policies, 513 and 524 or whatever that was.
46.
546.
46.
Sorry. Yep.
513, I'll just make those changes for that language and bring it back around for you to look at.
perfect.
And 546 can be on consent. I think it's really straightforward.
Very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate what you put into this, and safe home and have a good evening.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
night.